We are on the first afternoon break in the questioning of former Metropolitan Police Commissioner Paul Condon at the undercover policing inquiry. He has been asked a lot of questions about the meetings that he had with the Home Secretary about the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. He doesn't dispute the facts, in the majority of the facts anyway, in the documentation, but he doesn't like the tone of them. We've been treated to a lot of philosophical lectures, it feels, from the witness. I'm joined by Lindsay German of Stop the War. What have you made of what Paul Condon has had to say to us?
Well, I think it's very interesting because this morning he was quite critical of the whole way in which the SDS has operated. So of course that puts him in quite a good light if you believe everything he says. This afternoon, I think when it came to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, he's much more defensive. He's much more sort of irritated by the questions, and he's being shown all these statements that are written, minutes of things that are written by civil servants to do with his meetings with the Home Secretary. And he's sort of saying, well, they'll have to answer for what they've said. But it's obvious that whether or not they got certain things wrong, the general drift of what he said is extremely critical of the Lawrence inquiry, doesn't really feel that the police should be questioned in this kind of way. He also doesn't like the whole way that institutional racism within the police is addressed. He'd rather, it seemed to me, maybe I'm being unfair to him, but it seems to me that he'd rather have kind of individual bad apple cases of racism in the police rather than dealing with the fact that, as now is widely accepted, that it is an institutionally racist body. And very recently we've seen more evidence of that with the Charing Cross police station and various other things. Yeah,
no, I think you're completely right. I think it feels almost like he's trying to relitigate the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. There was a lot of times where he was asked, why he did certain things, and he just started going back to sort of complaining about the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. He started going on about the Salmon Principle wasn't being done properly and why that was a problem, and he started moaning about what the public gallery was like, and just. I mean, Barr was constantly trying to get him back on track, and he was just not having it. And talking over Barr was asking the same question 3 times. I mean, at one point he went, "You can ask me this question for the next 7 hours if you want. I'm going to tell you what."
Let's hope not. But, no, there's all that, and also, I mean, there's a real arrogance there about it all. But also, let's go back to remember what the Macpherson inquiry was about. Stephen Lawrence was murdered in cold blood. We now know, the police knew very, very quickly who the suspects were. There's all sorts of accusations of corruption and so on, why they weren't arrested, why even now not all of them have been arrested. So that was what the inquiry was about, and it was about institutional racism. It's a huge credit to Stephen Lawrence's family and the rest of the campaign they got where they got to. But this was something the police have resisted all the way through. And if you go back to Scarman, which was after the Brixton riots in the early 80s, that he drew back from saying it was institutionally racist. Now, what Macpherson did was to pin that on the Met, and absolutely rightly. And that's what he doesn't like, I think. And he's trying. And the truth is, he was the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, and if you look at his whole attitude to things, while he's, as I say, very critical of the SDS, what's he like on, for example, the Welling demonstration? The way he characterised that was, there was a demonstration miles away which was totally peaceful, that was okay, but all these people who turned up at Welling obviously had malicious intent, in some way or another, and he talked about there were life-changing injuries at Welling. Well, maybe there were, but I certainly don't remember hearing of them. It was a very violent demonstration because the police attacked it, but actually he seems to be exaggerating that as well in terms of how many people were injured and what the injuries were. I reckon, I'm pretty certain in fact, that the vast majority of injuries were from the police onto the demonstrators. And indeed, somebody that I knew well, Julie Waterson, who was one of the chief stewards, was hit on the head with a truncheon and got compensation, as came out earlier in the inquiry.
Yeah, he was adamant that he'd saved lives by rewriting that demonstration, which sounds like complete hyperbole. We've seen, like, throughout the day that the way in which he's approaching this process, he appears to have a lot more notes than we've seen most witnesses have, and it seems like he's pre-prepared a lot of his answers, and he's given a speech sometimes which doesn't really fit the question. Coming back to certain facts, certain like figures which he's got written down, kind of like trying to make the same points over and over, despite whatever Barr's trying to ask him about.
Well, he also even gave us a quote from Julian Barnes, the novelist, which I'm sure didn't just spring into his head this morning. So I think he's very, very, he's got lots of notes. He's very, very clear what he wants to say. And what he wants to say is his view of whatever it is, whether it's Welling or Stephen Lawrence or whatever it is, rather than actually look at the evidence that we have here and address seriously any criticisms of him. And that just, he's just refusing to do that, really.
Yeah, we had he mentioned Stokely Carmichael, which
which is obviously meant as instead of thinking, okay, that might be something you might accept, that people in the 60s did begin to discover institutional racism, which after all is almost as old. Well, it is as old as the American Republic. Rather than accepting this, he obviously thought that saying Stokely Carmichael came up with this phrase is meant to denigrate it and mean that it's not serious. Whereas for me, I would take that as something you would take seriously if Stokely Carmichael said it. Yeah,
but it was what I found particularly interesting was he's not the first of the managers to mention that. We've had other senior police officers name check him, and it just feels like maybe they've all been coached by the same people about what it is you're meant to say.
Surely not. I mean, can you imagine that happening? They get all their notebooks out and they all say the same. No, I think that definitely they are. And we've had years now of the police saying, I don't remember, things were different. I mean, they all come out with things were different in those days where everybody was racist, misogynist and so on. Well, actually, that isn't true. Many of us weren't, and not just people on the left, but many, many people rejected and certainly most people didn't like the levels of racism which were clearly there in the police right back going back to the 60s and 70s. So yeah, they've got a narrative they want to put, and it's that they did their best. It was a very, very difficult job. There was a few bad apples, but don't blame the rest of us. And I think we have to say that is really not the narrative that should come out of this inquiry.
No, absolutely not. And it's not credible. I mean, like he spoke this morning about what a good memory he had, how he was never bothered by memory loss, and yet he's so often this afternoon he's talked about
can't remember. Yeah. And senior moment he kept saying, which I feel, hang on, really, being somebody myself of an age approaching that of Paul Condon, I feel really you shouldn't just make light of these kind of things. Of course, it's perfectly acceptable for people not to remember something that happened 40 years ago or even 10 minutes ago. I mean, if you are affected in that kind of way, but it is a kind of insulting way of looking at it.
It is. We were just being alerted that things are starting up again. Thanks for joining us. Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I'd just like to say thanks for all the work you're doing, and I think we just need to keep going on this and get the truth out as much as possible.
Thanks ever so much. Cheers to everybody who's watching and liking and sharing. It makes a huge difference to have